So on Monday, we talked about the risks involved with international trade. In this 2 weeks lecture of international trade finance, the first week we're defining the international trade process and the documentation and the process that it actually involves and the parties involved with it. And then the following week, we'll talk about the actual financing of it, the pre-shipment, the post-shipment, factoring, and the Exim Bank financing, and then hopefully we'll get into international cooperation with respect to international trade. So World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, and some of the organizations that are involved in the international trade. So on Monday, we reviewed the risks involved with international trade, and very simply put, we talked about what if you were to buy something from eBay or some other website where you have an international delivery or international order, and what are some of the risks that you are taking? And obviously, the distinction is that when you have a trade for $20 or $100 versus a couple of $1 million, there's a significant difference, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize. In that, with Amazon or eBay, you always have that guarantee of or a security insurance, even of returning the product or getting a refund or getting some sort of a resolution through the actual facilitator like eBay or Amazon. Whereas when you do international trade, your facilitator is usually the legal system, which may not be as efficient as a commercial entity. So we need to define what risks we're taking, and obviously there are so many that I just cannot list all of them, and I don't think that even after several decades of working in banking, anybody can actually list all the risks, and it's an ever-changing environment. So having said that, we actually said that we could perhaps put the risks as payment, delivery, product, and legal issues. And then we actually said the insurance and logistics are part of these as well, although they may be the risks, but they also are facilitator or parties to the actual transaction. So with respect to the payment, we said that, sending the money and that, having the transaction at different times, and that you're also at a different location as to the importer and the exporter, and that kind of makes everything a little more complicated. We said that if you were to have a simple transaction at Walmart, you're at the same location at the same time, and the exchange happens simultaneously. You cannot walk away from the store without paying, and you cannot or you should not pay before you buy. So the idea is that with international trade, you do not have that simultaneity, and therefore you have that issue of who's going to pay first or who's going to deliver first. So we also have issues such as taxes, duties, international regulation as to the payments, and these are all some of the risks that need to be dealt with. We also have issues with delays and how we are delivering, when we're delivering, the vehicles that we're delivering. There are always unintended issues and there are intended issues. And location and actual delivery is always a problem. We talked about the product-related issues. There could be damage. There could be less than perfect condition that may require additional costs to make it right. So who'll pay for that? What if the product is not as we describe it, and how can we resolve this? And what if a product comes slightly different than what we asked or what we thought was going to be delivered? And then we talk about, some legal issues. What if, the transaction involves drugs or weapons or regulated products, and or there are some illegal drugs or illegal weapons that are within the shipment without your knowledge, and who's to blame for this? And then there's obviously issues such as quotas, tariffs, duties, and customs, and who will pay for this, who will go through the process, who owns the product, and when are all issues. We talked about the insurance and the logistics. So we need to know how they're involved, who pays for them, and whose responsibility starts when, and whose responsibility ends when. So what I want to do, I think, is to start with a process. And I actually want to start with a spreadsheet, because we are going to be including more and more parties to this transaction, and it will be like a flow chart. So the once we start with the process, there will be some issues that needs to be dealt with, like these risks that we talked about, and then we're going to start including more parties to help us with these issues and to help us with this process, and hopefully all we'll wrap up, and then Friday we'll talk about different kinds of documentation, the rules and regulation internationally, the Universal Commercial Code, and then international jurisdiction. And then next week we'll talk about financing. So the everything actually starts with what we call pro forma invoice. So we travel to another country, and it's how it used to be. In the past, we used to have these trade shows, and we still do, but not as much, I guess, in the past. And through the trade show, we get to see the products, we get to see and meet with the manufacturers, and we get to have some reality of the product that we will be transacting. So with the pro forma invoice, it's literally the intent, and we want to know how much, and we want to know the details of the actual product that we saw, and what everything would look like, and so we start everything with a not the actual invoice yet, but the intended invoice. So everything starts with a pro forma invoice. And like I said, nowadays you can actually have the product chosen out of a catalog, out of a website, out of an actual trade show. So our you know the products meeting phase is now involved a lot more, um, perhaps virtual or online um, vehicles. So after the pro forma invoice, now we have issues like we'll start with some details. We need to define what needs to be done. So we need to know actual payment, and with the payment, we need to know how much, how to make the payment, when to make the payment, and then who will make the payment, and where will the payment be made to. These may actually seem like very small issues, but even here locally, when you want to pay somebody, say a few $100s, you could write a check, you could Venmo, you could PayPal, you could pay cash, and all of them has certain repercussions. Paying with a Venmo or a PayPal, there could be fees involved. Paying with a check, there could be fees involved. Paying cash, well, the recipient may not want cash because cash is always an issue. And also, when you're transacting with a few $1 million of a product, cash may not be just feasible. So when, how, who are all issues with payments. And we also need to know shipping, or maybe I should just say logistics. And the logistics is a comprehensive term. It actually starts from the actual product packaging at the location of the exporter, and then from the exporter's locale to the port. And I'm always assuming that there's some sort of global trade involved, and therefore we're going to cross the ocean. Um, so if we don't, the truck actually goes to the point A to the point B, and you're pretty much done. But let's talk about the more comprehensive and inclusive transaction. So from the manufacturer, the packaging, and then from the manufacturer's warehouse to the truck. And even these little things, how will you get the product from the warehouse to the truck, from truck to the ship to the port, and then from ship port A to port B, and then from ship to the truck, and then from truck to our warehouse, and then opening the package. So that's all inclusive of the logistics. And so who will pay for it? Who will arrange it? Who pays what? And what sort of logistics is going to be involved? Are we going strictly sea route, or are we taking an airplane? Are we going to take railroad? And sometimes trucking may not be feasible. And again, we are in New Orleans, so we're blessed that we have a port, an international port right here. However, if you're in some other city, say Midwest, how are you going to get the um, product across from one port to you? Will you get a train, or will you actually have an 18-wheeler drive it to you? And also, if say you're on the West Coast and you actually have a delivery from Europe, how are you going to get that? Are you going to go around the world, or are you going to go across the US? So all of these are logistics issues, and they need to be decided at the time of, um, you know, finalizing the actual order. Remember, we're still at the pro forma invoice. So we are trying to gather all that's needed and see how much it's going to cost us, and the detail that we need to negotiate with the exporter in order to facilitate this trade. Then obviously with any other trade, we actually need insurance. Um, so who's going to pay for insurance? Whose responsibility it is? A lot of the times when the goods are on the ship board, free and clear, the product actually belongs to the importer. So the insurance actually covers from warehouse all the way to the ship. And then on the ship, whose responsibility is it? Who will insure it? What are you going to insure it for? And then from ship to the truck, and then so on and so forth. So all of this needs to be decided as how much it's going to cost, how much coverage you're going to get, what are you going to insure for? Are you going to insure for terrorism, act of God, piracy? I mean, it's things that you don't even think about are included in the insurance, and a lot of the times you may actually regret that you did not include that thing that you never thought was going to happen, but it happened. And I remember one time that in our import of cars, everything was done, but for some reason, and I don't remember why, um, a few cars actually had dirt droppings, and that was not included in the insurance. And the problem with that is if you actually leave that on the car, on the paint job, for the duration of the trucking, which for us take I think 2 weeks or so, that actually damages the paint, and there's acid in it. So it actually made a whole lot of trouble because these are brand new cars, and you can't like repaint a brand new car. So you have to include that into the insurance, and we've learned it in the hard way that including bird droppings into an insurance is actually responsibility of whoever is responsible for the insurance. In a lot of the cases, it's the importer. Then we have to decide on the product description. So again, this is an issue that may seem quite trivial. So I mean, you're thinking corn, like I was talking on Monday. How complicated can corn be? It turns out it can quite be complicated, and that's why they have these agricultural engineering degrees, where you hire an agricultural engineer to define what type of corn you're actually importing. So, with a furniture or a carpet or a car, you need to have exact definitions of what you are actually buying. It just blue 320 BMW, XI, but it just doesn't cut it. You need to have individual accessories included in it. I mean, everything that needs to be defined. Um, Even simple things, how it's going to be, packaged. Will there be film strips on it, or everything that needs to be included in that product description. So for that, we actually have to have, and I've seen these descriptions to go really thick, um, like manuals. And for agricultural, I've seen chemical composition. I've seen DNA analysis of just so that they are not, they conform with organic or they conform with no DNA, um, you know, amendments or. So this description can be quite significant, and a lot of the times people may not think that this is as significant, but it really is. Um, then we are actually thinking about the legalities. So the idea with legalities is, is it okay to export the goods? Are there any regulation, any quotas, any issues that needs to be dealt with? And then can it actually go through transit countries? So, for instance, let's say that you're going to be importing, uranium. It's a regulated substance, and it's a chemical that's quite, regulated internationally. Transferring from one country to the other is, I'm assuming, is a nightmare because it's regulated internationally. You cannot take it through some countries. Some countries simply will deny you entry, deny you transfer or access to their maritime uh, routes or to their actual land roads. So how will you actually get it there? So it might actually seem like if you're transporting corn, it's really not that big of a deal, or transporting carpets may not be that big of a deal. But if you are actually importing or exporting anything that's regulated somehow, and remember, just a few years ago, and I think there still is tariffs on aluminum from China. So these legalities include that, not just restricted extreme cases, but also cases where customs, there could be custom taxes, import restrictions, export restrictions, quotas, registration requirements, license requirements. You may need a approval from the World Health Organization. You may need an approval from the World Trade Organization. There could be measurement issues, um, and all of these actually become significant legalities that has to deal with the actual trade. And then you actually have representation needs. So what do I mean by representation? So then I don't mean lawyers yet. So think of it like if you are going to be making all these payments to the person, and let's say that we are the importer, uh, we still have the issue of who's going to make the payment and who's going to make the delivery first. So we need an agent that actually can be at the location at the exporter's place. Um, so the product description, we want to make sure that what is being loaded onto the ship is what we are asking. And therefore, we need to make sure that the inspection is actually done at the exporter's location rather than after we receive it. Because after we receive it, it may be too late. How are we going to send them back? It's not as if, like I said before, it's not like you can go to the Whole Foods to return an Amazon product. It is something that you have to reship back. And reshipping back is actually another import-export transaction. So all of that all over again with the same costs and sometimes more. Um, then there's always that legal costs added to it as well. So you need a representation. The exporter needs a representation, the importer needs a representation. So we are going to need somebody to represent us that we trust at the exporter's location. So we talked about the payment, the logistics, insurance, product description, legalities, representation, and then finally we're going to need some sort of um, intermediation. So the exporter and the importer are in two different countries, and we have two different languages, two different cultures, but more importantly, we have two different legal systems. And our expectations and their expectations may be completely different. Um, we may or may not have any trust, any confidence, and we have representation, yes, and they have representation here, but we also need somebody that we both trust, meaning we both need somebody to intermediate our transaction. Um, and this can be a bit complicated, but it is a necessity of the transaction. Unless we have somebody that we both trust, the transaction simply cannot happen. So at this point, we kind of need to explain this. And we had a brief discussion about this correspondent banking, um, concept. But at this point, we need to explain what correspondent banking means. So let's go to another sheet. Yes, I'll go back to the other. So let's say that we're talking about USA and then India. So let's say that this is Chase and this is Bank of India. So India, well, you know what? You should say Bank of America. I mean, if you're saying Bank of India, you might as well say Bank of America. So the idea is that these two banks are two separate banks. However, they need to act as an intermediary for international business. And one of the things that they need to do is to establish a relationship, and they need to act as if they're one single entity, as if they're in unison. So the way it usually works is that one of the banks will approach the other one, and they will simply explain that they want to form a correspondent banking relationship. And this relationship simply means that they will trust each other up to a certain amount of money. Let's say that for this example, $100 million. So up to $100 million, the Bank of America and Bank of India are considering to trust each other up to $100 million. So so they'll visit each other, they will exchange balance sheets and income statements and their financial statements, and then the credit departments of each bank will review this proposition. And if it is approved, then the Bank of America and Bank of India will become correspondent banks. And once they are correspondent banks, it is as if they will become one agent of each other. They will trust each other completely up to $100 million. Obviously, the amount can change. How long the relationship will last can change. However, in all practical purposes, Bank of America is now a correspondent of Bank of India. Bank of India is now a correspondent of Bank of America. And for this example, they are correspondent banks and they are agents of each other. So a person who's actually working for Bank of America, Bank of India will trust his or her word and vice versa. So for our purposes, the intermediation can actually be remedied by two correspondent banks. And we'll get to that a little bit today and then on Friday a little bit more in detail. So when we have the pro forma invoice, we are going to require a detailed analysis, a study of the payment details, logistical details, insurance details, product description, and we need somebody to actually help us with that. And then legalities, and then we need a representation, and we need intermediation. So these are the issues. Now, who will help us with these? So these are the parties of the actual transaction. So to begin with, for any import and export transaction, we have the importer and we have the exporter. I mean, these are usually the two parties that actually initiate the entire transaction. For the payment, we will probably have two correspondent banks help us. So I'm going to type in banks. Logistics, we're going to have a logistics company. And then we're going to have an insurance company. And then we're going to, so the product description, we need actually an inspection company. Inspection company is very similar to, when you buy a house, you hire an inspector. They go in, they check. I think the main difference for international trade is that the inspection company is multinational and they are going to have their own correspondents and their own agents, and they are multinational. So what we agree here in the US, their correspondent in Germany or India, in our exporters location, the inspection company there will make sure that what's being loaded onto the ship is what we actually decided here as the importer. So the legalities, now this can be a little bit more detailed. It's not just a legal company. In fact, this is a lot of the times, the government, and this can be multiple governments. Well, to begin with, we're talking about the exporters government and the importers government, and if you have any transit governments, and if you have any regulated products, then we're talking about international bodies such as World Health Organization, Trade Organization. It just depending on the product, you might actually need all those international organizations. So I just say government, and however, most of the time, as an importer, I may not know how things work, and my business is to import furniture and sell them. I don't need to know all of it. So how can I actually fix this? Well, a lot of the times the banks will actually offer you services to help you with the legalities. There are import-export companies that actually also do this. And depending on the type of the bank that you have or what services they offer and how they actually charge you for this, what commissions, what fees they charge, you might actually want to go with import-export companies. And again, the import-export companies purely offer you services to help you with your import, to help you with your export, or they can literally buy the product, bring it to you, and for a fee. So every import-export company is obviously different, but they can also provide you with just consultation and as an intermediation with the bank. However, in my own experience, I come from banking. We used to offer these services to our importers and exporters, and we obviously charge fees for it, and that's how we made our money. So the representation and intermediation, actually, believe it or not, most of them are offered by banks. So as you can see, most of the transaction is actually done with the help of the banks. We have the two correspondent banks on both sides, and they will provide their help with a lot of the times with the government involvement, with the import-export company, if there will be one involved. They might even have help you find a logistics company, insurance company, and inspection. They might offer you a full service and just wrap it up in one place, so you wouldn't have to deal with any of it. However, doing it through the bank will be slightly more expensive, and therefore you may be better off working with a logistics company that you haven't done for a long time. You might actually try to shop around for insurance, although most of the banks will have some sort of a sister company that's an insurance company. And inspection, again, most of the banks will have somebody that they're working with. However, you can also find your own inspection company. So they're there to help, but they will charge you a fee. So after we decide on all of these, in fact, I just want to take this imported companies out. It's making my column too big. So what I will do is I will actually now move to an invoice. So at this point, once we actually decide how everything works out, we go from pro forma invoice to an actual invoice. So once we have the invoice, we have to actually move on to the contract. Right? So remember, the pro forma invoice was just for us to have an idea. And then we actually have to resolve these issues with payments, logistics, insurance, and so on and so forth. And then we actually find companies to help us with these issues. And now we have an idea of how everything is going to work out, how much it's going to cost us, if it is to our liking, if it is acceptable to us. And then if everything works out, if everything is as we want them, then and talk about OCDA. So once we actually have all of this um, worked out and everything is to our liking, then we'll move on to the next stage and we'll ask the exporter to provide us an invoice. Now, at that point, once we ask for the invoice, that means we're willing to go ahead with the transaction and we want to buy it. Now, remember, all of this is now agreed upon with the exporter, and we already contacted all of these companies, and we are now ready to move to the next stage in our relationship. So at this point, we say, okay, let's have the invoice and let's start the transaction. We like to buy. Now, at that point, we need to create a contract. And with that contract, you need to include everybody into this contract. So what I'll do is I'm going to keep this contract right in the middle, and I'm going to make it red like that. But there will be two banks involved that will actually help us with the contract. And remember, the banks are our representation in each country, and they're also the intermediation. So I'm going to say Exporters Bank, and then Importers Bank. So, like for instance, once we have the contracts ready to be signed, the contract will be in 3 or 4 original forms, and the contract the exporter will sign at the exporter's bank. The importer will sign at the importer's bank. Because these two banks are correspondents and they trust each other, it's as if they signed it within everybody's presence. And then they will send the documents across each other. And then the importer will sign the exporter copy, exporter will sign the importer copy. Now we have a contract. Now, this contract has a special name. This is according to the international trade law, Universal Commercial Code, and we refer to this usually by a letter of credit. So the letter of credit is actually a contract, and most of the time it's irrevocable because simply once you actually say, okay, I'm buying it, it's not like you can actually say, I'm not going to buy it anymore. I gave up. So it's a little bit more demanding than buying a few $100 of groceries for more money. So it is an irrevocable letter of credit. It will have multiple copies, original copies, signed by the exporter's bank, importer's bank, signed by the exporter, the importer, and it will also include the logistics company, insurance company, inspection company, and any sort of representation who's actually involved in the actual trade. Remember, with the letter of credit, we are going to be sending the products from the exporter's country to the importer's country, and logistics company will be handling this, insurance will be handling this, and you're talking about a multi-million-dollar transaction, and therefore it needs to be airtight. So we want to make sure that the letter of credit is a airtight contract that is enforceable internationally. Now, obviously, we have the issue of jurisdiction. Now, we're always thinking that, if anything goes wrong, we could sue. But realistically, suing takes time and it's also significant cost. So we don't want to actually leave anything to suing. And furthermore, the jurisdiction is always an issue. The contract was specified, it's in the jurisdiction of blah, blah, blah. However, I mean, imagine you're buying something from Germany and there's a problem and you want to actually sue somebody in Germany. How will you actually know how to sue somebody in Germany? How would you know what your rights are in Germany or in India or in Brazil or in any other country? So that becomes a significant issue. We also have issues with the the realities of international legal enforcement. Not just how long it would take, but what will be the costs involved? How can we fix it, right? Like for instance, in the U.S., there's always a lien on a title, which you can repossess. However, in certain countries, the legal restrictions could actually impair you from actually taking possession of your own goods or on your product. It could be that it could take years before you can move forward. And what is a very simple process in the US that takes a few months could be actually years in another country, or simply may not be possible. Some countries go through arbitration, and those can actually leave you with unintended results. So all of this becomes a significant problem. So just because we have a contract does not mean that we are airtight. Just because we got our banks involved does not mean that we have an airtight transaction. So here, the World Trade Organization comes in, and we have the Universal Commercial Code. I'll talk about that on Friday a little bit. And letter credit is actually defined through the Universal Commercial Code in great detail and its enforceability. And we also have international arbitration, and most of the countries that are internationally active, most of the countries are part of this international arbitration, and therefore it allows for a little bit more legal scrutiny over depending on the local jurisdiction. And because we have this, international arbitration, I think that especially with the banks involved, the transactions, have a less chance of becoming a legal matter. They do still happen though. Just because everything is airtight does not mean that there's still some that's actually falling apart. And regardless of how many years of experience you have, you still may actually overlook simple details, and unfortunately, it can actually cost you significant amount of money. So anyhow, that's about it for today. And what I like to do on Friday is we'll talk about the letter of credit, and then we'll talk about different kinds of letter of credit. And these are actually very important because then we're going to move on to the financing of it. So we'll talk about sight, deferred, confirmed, unconfirmed letter credits. We're going to talk about standby letter credits, letter guarantees, performance guarantees, and how they can be enforced and how they can be used in our financing operations. And then we'll define the bankers' acceptance and how we use it to finance it. And then next morning, and next week, we'll talk about the others. So, like I said, we'll talk about the details of the letter of credit, and then we'll move on to how we use it to finance the international trade. So that's about it for today, and I really appreciate you guys working with me. And please let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing you all in person, hopefully. And thank you. Take care. Bye now.